I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. We have with us a great friend of the podcast, a legendary journalist. It's Jane Perlez, who spent 7 years as a reporter in China, was the Beijing bureau chief, many other roles at the Times over the years as a foreign correspondent, a great friend of the podcast, a great friend of CSIS, and now she has her own podcast called Face Off, the U.S. versus China. And I wanted to ask Jane about what is the journalism climate in China right now, and with, a bunch of news coming our way between the U.S. and China. So she's the perfect person to have on. Jane, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Andrew. It's very good to be here with you. I really admire your podcasting efforts.
Oh, well, thank you. So I want to ask you off the top, when you were the bureau chief in Beijing, you had something like 15 reporters working for you. Those numbers have dramatically changed at the Times. They've changed at the Journal. I think the Post has, minuscule, if any, staff there right now. What has happened in China to American journalists as of late?
Well, it's quite a saga, actually. And I think it's actually at a place which the Chinese like, which means there are fewer American journalists in China at the moment when we really need them. The saga started basically in 2018 when the Trump administration version 1 decided to kick out something like 60 Chinese journalists from the United States. Most of them were in Washington. They said that these journalists were spies. Now, I have little doubt that some of them did write papers home to the MSS, the security services. But my argument has always been better to have them in front of you so you can see what they're interested in rather than kicking them out. But they were kicked out with the full knowledge that there would be retaliation against American journalists in China. And right on the money, in 2020, the Chinese kicked out about 20 American journalists from China. So that leaves a handful of journalists left, but there are about actually a little under 20 journalists from the United States in China at the moment.
Under 20 total?
Under 20 total American journalists.
That's incredible.
But to cover a population of 1.4 billion, not to mention that it's our most severe and serious strategic rival.
It makes it very hard for U.S. journalists to know what the real state of affairs is between the U.S. and China, correct?
Well, yes, I think so. Other people will argue, well, we have plenty of coverage from Washington. But to me, that's the problem, because the coverage from Washington, which has a large element of fear-mongering and a lot of our own version of propaganda, the heavy emphasis is on that rather than what's going on inside China. I do want to add, though, that those journalists who are lucky enough to be in China are doing a great job under very, very hard circumstances. Number one, surveillance is unbelievable, and it's very hard to get people to talk. So there are workarounds, but it's very difficult. So we are left now, the New York Times, where I was bureau chief. There are 2 journalists in Beijing. There are 3 for the Wall Street Journal in Beijing. There were 15. And the Washington Post has no journalists based permanently in Beijing.
Zero. I want to take you back to something you just said. We all have heard about the surveillance state in China, and we've, with particular regard to the Uyghurs, but we also know that China has a massive surveillance operation, particularly in every one of its major cities. What is it like for a journalist to operate under that type of surveillance?
Well, it can be very unnerving, from being detained in a police station overnight or more to being tailed to wherever you were going. I can tell you, it was sort of amusing at the time. We didn't take it too seriously, but it was unnerving, I have to say. When I went up to the North Korean border in 2018, for example, we were doing a story on how China was keeping the North Korean economy afloat, even though it was denying it was doing so. And as soon as we got off the aircraft, there was a tail on us. They peruse every aircraft, every air manifest going into airports to see if there are certain people that they want to surveil. So this whole day, when we were looking for factories that were organizing manufacturing inside North Korea, we were tailed by 7 cars. In the midst of all this, we had an appointment to find a factory manager who we thought was going to Pyongyang every month. And we were able to dodge these people in a shopping mall and get inside a pizza parlor. And we were able to interview this woman who said, Yes, I go to Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, every month with $100,000 in my knapsack. So it's a lot of dodge it and trying to get off their tail. But there are more serious events where people, for example, who went to Xinjiang when it was still possible. I don't think it's possible anymore. But as soon as you landed in Xinjiang, you would be followed very intensely and not be able to meet anybody because you couldn't put a Uyghur person in danger of being seen with a foreign journalist. Not that's not possible.
I mean, this is really stuff that's out of a spy novel or a Tom Clancy movie.
Well, except it's much more serious and it's real.
Yeah, it's real. Well, so if you're a reporter in Beijing right now, you have to assume that the Chinese government knows every source you're meeting with, that they know every interview you're going to do. They know what you're typically where you might do those interviews. Is that all right?
Well, look, I can't speak to that accurately because I'm not there and I haven't been there since COVID. But that's a rough picture of it. The ways to get around it, I think some of the ways that reporters are getting around it are absolutely brilliant. How do they do this? For example, they use WeChat and other social media to find people who might be willing to talk to them. And they get hold of these people and talk to them as best they can, as secretly as they can, or even openly in some cases. In one case, I thought this was really ingenious. The New York Times bureau in Seoul wired up a food delivery woman in Shanghai so that she had a video camera with her. And every stop she made, she was taking video. And by the end of the day, she could describe where she'd been, and we could see where she had been. And we could total up that she made $17.83 in 12 hours of working. So there are now in the digital age ways of working around it, but it's far from satisfactory. And I think, Andrew, the biggest question really is what is the social contract like these days between the Chinese people and the government? How solid is it? That social contract is basically we, the government, give you enough livelihood and jobs, and in return, you support us unquestionably. Now, you'll hear stories that that is fraying. It has to be because 25% unemployment among people under 25, jobs much scarcer than they were, prices
Not to
higher.
mention the way they handled COVID. A lot of people are
Exactly.
still traumatized by that.
Exactly.
So, what do you notice about China's spread of news and information worldwide? That we know that they've been a propagandist themselves. There's a great story in CNN.com today about how the Chinese government is thrilled that the Trump administration has canceled VOA and RFA, which, I'll even read you. It said one nationalist influencer called it a truly gratifying. Another said he was laughing his head off. State media editorial hailed the demise of what it called the lie factory.
Well, the Chinese government has a very low opinion of Voice of America. So I'm sure that they are totally thrilled that Voice of America is seeing its demise. And I'm sure that they are planning very quickly ways to fill the vacuum. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure that Chinese propaganda is all that successful. I mean, on a very simple level, you'll notice that the copies of China Daily that hang around in Washington, D.C. or New York, nobody ever takes them. Nobody really takes it too seriously. But they will find ways to capitalize on this. And I think American government sponsored what they call propaganda is a favorite and easy target of Beijing.
And what is it like now in terms of, over the past 7 years, how has the U.S. China political economic relationship evolved since COVID with Xi in power? Now we have President Trump. What's the status of that now?
Well, I'd say that the economic relationship is under severe stress given Trump's insistence on imposing tariffs. Now, so far, he hasn't imposed the 60% tariffs that he threatened when he was still a candidate, but he has imposed 20% tariffs on China, which is actually perhaps a little less than people expected. But, I think the major economic relationship still continues. The United States can't really continue its consumer habits without the Chinese economy. Let's take Apple, for example. All Apple phones are made in China, and they will continue to be made in China in vast majority, even though Apple is trying to diversify to Vietnam and India. Apple is finding difficulty in diversifying to those places. There are no Chinese EVs in the United States because the Biden administration and the Trump administration after it has banned them. but they'll find ways to get them in via Mexico, most probably. So I'd say the economic relationship continues.
Interesting to know. I mean, some are saying it's the most fraught it's been in a long time. Some are saying that, with the tariffs, as you just mentioned, economy is going to be strained both there and here. What are your thoughts in terms of the global economy and the relationship that the United States and China and how it's evolving over tariffs and other penalties?
Well, I think the Chinese are going to continue to export like crazy to the global south and to other places, to other developed countries, by the way. For example, their EV industry is going gangbusters. They are producing EVs faster than we can count. I mean, Norway's a small country, a really small country, and they've gone from zero Chinese EVs, I don't know, late last year to 11% of their cars are now Chinese EVs. So it's not only the global south where China is exporting to, it's exporting to developed countries. I think in Australia, where I grew up, but I think their Chinese EVs are also growing. Why are these cars doing so well? Because they're cheap and they're well designed.
And people like driving them, apparently.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. They're a battery on wheels with lots of fancy things inside to play with.
On our podcast, The Trade Guys, that I do with Bill Reich and Scott Miller, we talk about Chinese EVs all the time. And my question always is, do you think Americans would actually drive a car made in China if it was available? And what they always say is that, well, Americans didn't used to think that they would drive Toyotas either. And now look at how many Toyotas are out there. So obviously they'd probably do pretty well here too.
Oh, I think so. We have as our guest on our podcast, Face Off, Michael Dunn, who is really the best on EVs, if I may say. He worked for GM in China before there were EVs. He worked in Indonesia, so he knows Asia very well. He knows China well. And he points out that the Chinese found a guy who really understood batteries. They found the sources that you need, of the ingredients that you need for batteries, like lithium and nickel, etc. And then they hired, guess what? They hired a designer from Audi.
Right.
So this was for BYD. And BYD has, the sleekest cars on the road. And by the way, there's a lot of competition among the Chinese EV makers. Now Xiaomi, which was used to be just considered to be a phone maker, is now coming in with even sleeker models. So because there's competition within China, I think their cars are getting better and better.
Let's talk about another American industry that is at some peril when it comes to China. Let's talk about Hollywood. Hollywood has traditionally, to have a really big hit, you have to also do well overseas, and in particular in the Chinese market with 1.4 billion people. What's happening now with Hollywood films in China?
Well, I'm loath to say that it's in the tank, but it certainly hasn't gone as Hollywood had hoped. Back in 2012, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, when they were both vice presidents, signed a deal in which the Chinese would allow 34 movies from Hollywood into China, and China would take some small take. And we talk about this in our episode in Face Off with Peter Law, who was a big producer for Legendary in China. And he describes how American movies did really well in China in the teens. There was the Great Wall with one of the great American actors. There were other big animated movies that did very well. And then the Chinese decided that they wanted to have it their way, and Hollywood movies weren't allowed in so readily. There were some problems with censorship, which didn't go down too well. I mean, at one period, it was going so well that Eisner of Disney wanted to be ambassador to Beijing so that he could push the movies.
Smart.
Smart. But I don't think he wants to be ambassador to Beijing anymore. And now the Chinese have come out with their own amazing smash hit called Naja 2, which is an animated movie about a mythological figure in Chinese history. And it clocked $1 billion in the first 2 weeks in February. And that's almost a world record for a take at the box office.
That's extraordinary. So they've built up their industry significantly.
Very much so. Some American movies still do quite well, like Barbie did quite well, but not at the rate that they're used to.
Jane, before we go, I want to ask you about the state of national security when it comes to China. We're constantly talking about Taiwan. CSIS, of course, has done a lot of research on the Taiwan equation, and everybody in Washington at one point or another is talking about what is Beijing actually going to do with Taiwan? What's your take on the current state of affairs?
Well, I tell you something. I think my biggest worry is not so much Taiwan, because it's very hard to tell what either side's going to do. But my biggest worry is the South China Sea. You may recall it's a long time ago now, but in 2001, there was a collision mid-air over the South China Sea between an American surveillance plane, ergo spy plane, and a Chinese fighter jet. And the outcome was very happy because the American pilot did a great, amazing feat of landing the spy plane onto Hainan Island, which is part of mainland China, with all 26 crew on board and alive. This was a plane chock-a-block with all kinds of spy equipment. They were out in international waters when they were hit, and they were looking in. We don't know exactly what for, but presumably to see the state of the Chinese military or some such thing. So that had happy ending thanks to really great diplomacy and better relations between Washington and Beijing. I think what worries me, and I think what worries a lot of people who know about the South China Sea, is another collision like that is highly possible. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, there were near misses between Chinese fighter jets and Allied planes, one from Australia and one from the Philippines, I think. Now, if something like that happened again, what happened in 2001 happened again, first of all, the American pilot would not land on Chinese soil, verboten. Fear too many worries about the crew being taken forever. So the American plane would most likely just sink in the ocean. Then what would happen? There would be a race to the site, to the crash site, by Chinese boats and American boats. And who would win that race? Likely the Chinese, because they've got faster and certainly more boats than the United States has in its entire Navy, and probably in the South China Sea. So that looks like a very unhappy, serious situation, and who knows where it would lead, with many crew members, many American crew members presumed dead at the bottom of the ocean because a Chinese fighter jet had hit the plane.
Sure. Jane, final question. Do you think that there are American journalists in Beijing and in China today that actually fear for their safety, fear because of the reporting that they're doing, or do they feel pretty secure there?
Well, I don't, I'm very reluctant to speak to situations where I'm not there. I think that American journalists in Beijing take great precautions, and I don't think that the Chinese are so stupid as to do something with those American journalists. So I'm reluctant to say, but I think that I'm sure there are certain safeguards, and I'm sure that the journalists are very careful. It's an unholy situation, and I just wish it was better.
Jane Perlez, host of the amazing podcast Face Off, the U.S. versus China. Jane, thanks for being a friend of the podcast and coming on to talk about some of the latest and greatest.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always great to talk to you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.
Hi, Truth of the Matter listeners. I'm Naveen Girishankar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department and the host of CSIS's newest podcast, Betting on America, where we explore the global technology race and what it'll take for the United States to come out on top. Join me as I sit down with leaders from business and government to understand the risks and the rewards of investing in the technologies and industries of the future in a community near you. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to learn how and why we are betting on America.